those moments and every moment where you don't have meaning, it's really important for you to have the strength to forge that meaning and to start looking for that meaning for yourself.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Tumblin. Today I have the privilege of talking with Shane from Renaissance Wisdom. Shane runs an Instagram page called Renaissance Wisdom, where he shares a lot of ancient philosophical ideas. He gives his personal input on a lot of it as well. It's a really great page. Check that out. Shane is also an author. He is currently writing a book on how we need to take personal responsibility for our lives and stay away from the herd, so to speak. So we had a great conversation about a wide variety of philosophical ideas. No spoilers. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but I'm going to let it run here. I hope you enjoy it. Cheers. Hello, Shane. Welcome to the podcast, man.
Hey, Brandon. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to get on and talk a little bit today.
Yeah, man. How you doing today?
Pretty good. We just got back from Miami, so recovering from a little bit of sunburn here. But other than that, I'm feeling well rested. Had a nice little trip to get away and kind of reset. So feeling good. How about yourself?
Oh, I'm not too bad. I don't have a sunburn, but that's not the worst problem to have in the middle of COVID. So
yeah, for sure.
So good luck on that. Yeah. So I guess just to get started here, we'll do a little introduction on what you do. So you run an Instagram page called Renaissance Wisdom. And so I'd like to just start by just talking about that. What sort of your aim is and your goal is for that page, what you're trying to achieve, and we'll go into it from there.
Okay, great. So Renaissance Wisdom, I started the page. It's almost exactly 4 months ago. I started it just to kind of spread the word. I've been working on a book about Renaissance philosophy for a while, and obviously a huge part of doing anything successfully is marketing. So that, my page that's my attempt to kind of spread the word about what I'm doing. I do daily posts, Monday through Sunday. I do a post every day. Usually it's caption with just kind of my take on whatever the quote is I use for the day, along with 2 times per week, I try to do like a longer, like a carousel slide. Usually somewhere between like 8 to 10 slides. And I try to do more of like an informational post. Sometimes it's philosophical ideas, sometimes it's history, sometimes it's myth, just kind of a blend of different ideas that I would get out of the past. And so I just kind of help to share some of that wisdom on someone's daily feed. I think there's a lot of just completely worthless stuff on Instagram. And my attempt is just to add at least one positive kind of thing into your feed every day. So.
Yeah, that's great, man. Like you, I gotta say, you have a really active community. Like I see a lot of engagement on your posts, and I feel you do you put a lot of energy into responding to people and sort of giving your thoughts and not necessarily in an overly positive way. Like you said, there's a lot of crap on Instagram. What I notice is that sometimes you have people that are just way too positive, and it's good. Positivity is good, but I think at the same time, life sucks sometimes, you have to figure out how to deal with that. And so life's not all rainbow and sunshines. And so learning the philosophy and how to deal with that properly, sometimes you have to talk about some things that may not be considered necessarily happy, but that give you a better life in the long run.
Definitely. I started out, most of my life, I was very much like a person that was in my own head. I was like a really angsty teenage kid and wrote like really depressing poetry. It was just like, that was my identity. Like I was the emo kid, right? I sung in like this little like pop punk band.
Yeah.
And there was like this one day, I think I was around 19. I was on a summer break from nursing school, and I was listening to a band of horses that I really enjoy. And I just noticed how happy they were, like just to be playing music. And I made me really conscious of the fact that I was choosing not to be happy, that I was choosing this kind of brooding, dark, depressed state. And I put a lot of effort into it. And then I ended up like shifting way too far to the other extreme, and I became like the Tony Robbins, like Think and Grow Rich, just like super overly positive person. And then I fell into philosophy, and I think that really helps balance out, right? Like, stoicism, you talk about temperance, like that middle path. I think that's the way to be, right? Just to be kind of realistic and understand that there are positives and negatives, and just kind of taking a realistic approach to everything.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting to me because I talk a lot about stoicism, and not just stoicism, but all kinds of different philosophies. And I'm definitely not I'm not the person on Instagram that's like, really happy and like smiling and like encouraging people to go out there and live their best lives. Like, I give it to people as real as I can. And I don't try and be depressing about it, but I try and just really tell the truth as best as I think it is. And what's interesting to me is that people respond to that really well. And I think it's because I think it's because it's real. But I don't know, like, what's your thoughts on that? Because I see some people that they go towards the positivity, but at the same time, sometimes I get some really great connections from people and some great comments from people on things that are, again, not necessarily positive, but that are true and real. Have you experienced anything like that, or what's your thoughts on that?
Definitely. I've noticed on my page that I get like some of my closest connections with my followers and people that interact with my page are people that'll a lot of times like send me a DM, or they'll comment on a post, and they'll just kind of say that they disagree with it. And it's interesting, right? Because those people that disagree, like I could just respond with like, oh, you're being a hater, you're being negative. But instead I actually, yeah, exactly. And I noticed that, like, something I've been really fortunate on my page is I just don't have like trolls, but I see it on a lot of the other larger philosophy pages where you they'll do a post and they've got 100 comments, and it's like 75 people just trolling. um but I think that, like, engaging with someone that disagrees with you and just kind of explaining your viewpoint and listening to theirs, it does create that engagement. And then people feel like they're a part of a community a little bit too. So I think it's really important, and that's something that I think that is really, really important, is to engage with different ideas and kind of challenge yourself. And my favorite philosopher is actually Nietzsche. And there's a quote by him that I love, and it's from like Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I don't know the exact quote, right? I'm paraphrasing, but it basically says that, everyone's asking me for the way, but like I'm telling you, there is no the way, right? Like, there's my way, and I'm no longer ashamed of my way, but that's what I've found. And I think that as human beings, we want to be so certain that we're right that we need everyone else to be wrong. And I think that it's like a really rigid stance that we take, just maybe because of our ego, or maybe just so that we feel like our beliefs are correct, right? But I think that, like, I can believe something and it works for me, and you can believe something totally different and it works for you, and that's okay. That's part of the human experience, is that, some of us are, raised in the West, and some of us are raised in the East, and there's just totally different paradigms and philosophies that go into living. So yeah, I mean, I think that's important, right? Just to engage that dialogue, to have conversations with people that view things a little bit differently, and you can still respect each other a lot, even though you maybe disagree.
Yeah, well, and I have a full episode on that topic, and I think it's called controversial. Let's be controversial, which is probably a
Yeah.
controversial title. But I don't aim to be controversial. But my whole point in that episode was that, like, listen, if there's something you and I disagree on, how are we ever going to get to the bottom of it if we don't talk to each other, right? And I think that's what people miss, is that it's like, okay, you're wrong. It's like, okay, well, why am I wrong? It's like, no, you're just wrong. It's like, well, no, like, let's talk about it. And for me personally, I'm the same way. Like, I get people who disagree with me in a respectful manner, and I absolutely love it, because I always learn something from it. Even if the result is something that perhaps suggests that I'm on the righter side. Like, if I'm right, I don't want to be too egotistical about it, but let's just say I'm right about it. I still learn something from the person, because at the very least, what I'm learning to do is I'm learning to attack my own position from someone else's perspective. And in doing that, that makes my argument stronger because I know how to defend it now, and I know someone else's perspective and someone else's view on my argument.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that you can't. I try to be really slow to claim certainty on anything, to say that, like, yeah, this is like the truth. But if you're going to make that claim, you cannot make a claim of certainty that's genuine if you don't fully understand at least the number one opposing side of it, right? Like for anybody that has something they truly believe in and they don't understand the counter arguments, you can't really say that your belief is based on anything firm, because you don't understand the other viewpoint, right? So how can you really know that where you stand is solid?
Well, people have a tendency to do that. They go after the simple. They like to attach onto. I should be saying we like to attach onto sort of ideologies and stuff. And I mean, I'm curious to know what you think that is. Personally, I always thought it was because we like to. First of all, we like to feel smart, right? Because it's so easy to just cling on to something and say this is the truth now. But I also think it's like it's easier. Like, critically thinking is hard, right? There's no doubt about it. For you, it's so much easier to read a book and completely live by that book, not completely live by that book, but try your best to embody that whatever philosophy that they are discussing, than it is for you to actually read the book, critically think about each point, consider what you agree with, what you don't agree with, and then take the good and leave the bad. Like, it's so much more work to critically think.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is a lot more work. And I think there's like a lot of cognitive dissonance that I think is really, really disruptive for most people, right? Like, people like you said, it's easier to have the black and white, right? Where you're just like, well, killing is wrong. Like this is the example I always use, right? Killing is wrong. Like, it's easy. Like, everyone can get behind that, right? But then when you think about it critically, you're like, okay, well, what about when someone's trying to kill you? What about when someone's trying to kill someone that you love? What about when you're trying to defend the country that you live in and like you're being invaded? Like, what about during World War II, when like there was this super evil force that basically completely dominated the entire world? Like, should everyone have just, and I'm like, the United States, right? We tried to stay out of that so long, to the point where like basically the rest of the world had fallen before we got involved in it. But it's like, should the US have done that? Should we have just like stood on the sidelines and been like, nah, like, it's okay, you could just take over everything? So I think that, you just can't really say those like black and white statements like killing is always wrong, right? Everything is conditional, and you have to really use that, like, that stoic temperance and that prudence to kind of look at each situation on a case by case basis. And like you said, it's a lot more work. And I think that that's maybe what scares people away from doing that sometimes, is that, like, I don't want to have to think through every single little like nuance and every single small conditional kind of thing that could happen that could change this. So
Yeah, well, it's just like you said, it's so much easier, and we love ideologies because we don't have to think about it, And there's this great lyric that from the song, and it's basically like, there's cracks in these walls upon closer inspection. And I love that, because to me that's such powerful imagery, because you can imagine like any argument, any philosophy, it doesn't matter, anything, any country, it might look whole when you're looking at it from afar. But then when you start getting a little bit closer, you start to see, okay, well, there's a big crack going down the side. You get a little bit closer and you see, oh, well, actually, there's some pinholes here. So, you can imagine like that's how philosophies are as well, is that when you're looking at it from afar, you see it as this whole simple thing. But as you get closer, as you start to see the pixels a little bit better, what you see is flaws and like you said, nuances and situations where it might not actually work. And so again, it's so easy for us to, and it's hard. It's hard because you can't zoom in on everything, because like, what are you going to do throughout your day-to-day life? Like, you can't focus on everything. Some things you have to take for granted in your life so that you can actually go off and do things. But at the same time, when we're talking about things like morals and ethics, these very complicated issues and even political issues, it's like, well, no, these are things that we should really take the time to deeply consider and talk about.
yeah, I agree. And then I think like, going back to kind of where we were talking about like like Nietzsche, like my way, right? That's where I try to live my life a lot is I very rarely, or I try to be very cognizant to not say things like, this is the truth, right? But what I will say is like, listen, I don't really know the certainty on this subject, but here's what I believe. And, I'm okay if someone believes something different. Like I don't need to convince them because I know that, ultimately even claiming certainty myself, right? It's very difficult to do that. And I think that's that like that cognitive dissonance that really like people just need to be okay with cognitive dissonance. Like it's okay to not know, or it's okay to look at something from one direction and it looks perfectly fine and look at it from another direction and it looks like totally wrong. Like it's all right. Like you don't have to have certainty to live a good life or to be fulfilled or to be, a good human being or to be a functioning member of society, right? There can be that dissonance there and you can live a perfectly effective life.
Yeah, I mean, no one's perfect, and I know it's such a cliched thing, but like we're all so human at the end of the day. We're gonna make mistakes, and we're gonna, even like in our philosophies, like we might think we might have a philosophy that we want to live by. First of all, the philosophy might not be right, but then secondly, we might not be able to actually live up to that philosophy. In fact, I would say that you won't be able to live up to that philosophy. Like there's a measure of how good a philosophy is, and the absolute best that you can be is to match that philosophy. However, we're human, we're flawed, we're imperfect, and so we're very unlikely to actually reach the heights of that philosophy. We're very likely to be somewhere in the middle. And like you said, that's okay. You don't have to be perfect. You can work on getting better. You can work on being a better person, strengthening your arguments, critically thinking about things. But I think where it gets to me is like, it's like you said, when you have a debate or you're arguing with someone and they just say, no, this is the way, this is it. And it's like, okay, well, if it is, then you should better damn well be able to explain to me why it is. And that's where people struggle, and that's what I found is that whenever someone gets really defensive with me, and they're defending their position too hard, I think I ask them like why do they think that? And that's normally when they fall apart because they haven't really thought about it on any deep level.
Yeah, I found the same thing that like typically if you push people by asking certain questions and listen, this is a thing, right? This is why Socrates got put to death, like
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
this is why he's the gadfly, right? Because people don't like to be questioned to the point that they realize their logical fallacies, and it's very infuriating. It's very like difficult for one's ego to take. So I definitely find that a lot of times if you like ask people questions that force them to kind of answer from like a place of like where their belief came from, they typically end up at a point where their back is like against the wall, and the wall is like you said, it's got all these cracks in it, and they're standing in front of the wall trying to defend the wall, and they feel it like crumbling behind them, and that's where they just start lashing out. Like they either like they get really angry, or they make like a personal attack or whatever. There's a lot of different things like they can throw out at you, but that's typically where I find conversations devolve, is like when someone realizes the shakiness of kind of like where they're standing from.
Yeah, and I take no pleasure in that. And what I mean, but like I had a not an argument, a debate with someone a few weeks ago, and it was about communism versus social democracy versus capitalism, sort of what we have here in the West. I was arguing that what we have here in the West is obviously not optimal, and there's bad things about it, but it's been the best so far in terms of freedoms and in terms of wealth generation and all that. And they argued on the basis of communism, and we started getting into the details about it, and it got to the point where she realized that she was completely wrong on something she assumed. Uh, and it was actually George Orwell, because George Orwell was a social democrat, right?
Right.
He believed in socialism through capitalism. So you don't just get rid of capitalism. What you do is you have capitalism to keep the efficiency going, and then you have socialist programs such as free healthcare, such as free education, to sort of keep to give opportunity to the most vulnerable at society. And she had thought that he was a communist. And so what
Right.
happened was very interesting. I mean, again, I take no pleasure in this, but I explained to her why he wasn't actually a communist, and she didn't know the difference between social democrat and communism. And she just fell apart. Like and I mean like she broke down because she held this belief for 16 years. And it just it people build their personality off of ideology sometimes, and then when you dissolve that ideology, they have nothing. There's nothing of themselves, and they just fall into chaos. And it's so hard to see, but what are you going to do? Like, you got to tell the truth and debate as best you can, but it's still, there's no pleasure in seeing someone sort of fall into that state, you know?
Yeah. What specifically, like what you're talking about, right? So it's really interesting. I'm studying about the Renaissance so much. I actually just did a post on this, but I talked about like Savonarola. Like he was a Dominican like friar, like a priest that basically got in charge of Florence in the end of the 1490s. And then basically, the 1400s, those were like specifically like 1440 to like 1490. Those were like the golden years of the Renaissance in Florence. Like that's when like Michelangelo was coming up, Da Vinci, like Lorenzo de Medici. Like you had so much art, you had so much philosophy. I mean, it was truly like a golden age. Like everybody was really involved in republicanism. The economy was great. Like they were recovering from the plague. I mean, just all the stars aligned to make this like beautiful golden age, right? And when Lorenzo ended up passing away, Savonarola, he came in and he took over, and he basically made the citizens believe that the second coming of Christ was like drawing very near. And he started telling prophecies, and then about the same time, the King of France started invading Italy. And so now you have these like massive army that nobody can oppose. Like Italy didn't have an army in this time, right? They had like a lot of mercenaries, and the mercenaries a lot of times wouldn't even fight each other. They would basically, like, in the middle of the battle, they would set up sides, and they would like offer, they basically like play like a chess game with the other mercenaries, and because they didn't want people to die, because that's their money. And so a lot of times they would like do these shows where they kind of like pretend to wage battle for months or even years sometimes. And then now you have this like battle hardened like French army just walking through, and the mercenaries are like, we don't want anything to do with this, we're going to get slaughtered. So they were just coming through, conquering everything. And you got this guy, he basically was preaching that the Renaissance culture that they had embraced, the humanism, the art, like the human achievement, the study of philosophy, these things were led to a corruption of Florence, and that was their downfall. And so he preached this really, really austere, kind of crazy, like socialist, but really, really religiously dogmatic inspired kind of socialism. And he ended up, doing this bonfire of the vanities, and they gathered up millions of dollars of art and dresses and all these things, and they burnt them. They set up these squads that would go out and torture people if they opposed what they said. And that's the problem with giving up individualism, right? Is that when you take away like the freedom of the individual to kind of decide for themselves the way that they want to live their life, and you indoctrinate them, or you force them to act a certain way or believe a certain thing, it really stifles creativity. It just stifles everything. And like we were talking about before too, when you completely shut down and oppress like any kind of opposing side, then there's no alternate view, and your own position becomes weaker because you don't have this like opposing force to strengthen yourself with too. And that's something that I definitely talk about like heavily in the book, is this idea of like individualism and the promotion of kind of like individual liberty. And that goes with like, there is a civic kind of thing attached to that, like what you said, where providing education and things like that. Like the people who are successful are the people that run society. They do have an obligation to provide for even the lowest parts of society, right? So it's not like, I think I kind of tend to side with you, right? We're kind of like in between the kind of like the capitalism and some of the socialist elements. So I think you need both for a society to really thrive. And that was something that you saw in Florence too, is the wealthy, they had a really strong sense of obligation to their community. And so when they made money, they would pay these artists and they would have them like design, beautiful things that all the citizenry could enjoy. They set up like public squares and they redid churches. They set up things like dowry funds. So dowries were really important back then, right? Like you had to get your daughter married off because, women were kind of considered property. And this thing would happen where sometimes wealthy families, they would have multiple daughters, right? And it would bankrupt them if they provided dowries for all their daughters. So that they set up this state fund where you would put in a set amount of money when your daughter was born, and they basically would trade it and they would earn interest off of it through like banking and just different investments. And then they knew that so many of these girls would die before the time they reached marriageable age. So they kind of factored that in. So it was kind of like a combination of like insurance and a fund, so that when a young girl would turn the age to be married, the state would provide them with the money for a dowry. So, like obviously that's like a super misogynistic like example, right? Because of the time period, but it shows you that, the government was actually involved in some way of like trying to provide for the citizen. So it was just different, right? Like there was this kind of capitalist, like free market idea, but the wealthy, they had this civic duty. It wasn't like it is now where you have like mega billionaires, you've got like the Bezos and stuff out there that they have all this money. And, I know they do like charities and they're involved in things like that, but it's different than being involved in the community. It's different than being involved in like really trying to do something.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that capitalism untethered results in inequality. There's no doubt about that. Like as you make more money, it's much, much easier for you to make more money and more money. It's the same thing with opportunity, right? Like when you first graduate from university, you're probably lucky to know one person in industry. So you graduate, maybe someone that works for a company and you can get a job that way. 5-10 years down the road, you now have a huge network of people. And so it's hard for you to get one opportunity, but once you get one opportunity, if you do your job decent, it's easier to get 2 opportunities and 3 and 4 and 5, and it sort of multiplies out of control from there. And that's sort of what capitalism does untethered, and this is why we have things like tax brackets, for example. If you make under a certain amount, guess what? You don't pay much tax. If you make billions of dollars, your taxes are significantly higher. So we have, and to get on the topic of sort of where the line is drawn between what the collective is supposed to give to you and what you are supposed to take as an individual, that's a line that I really like to talk about now and sort of hammer down what your thoughts are on that. Because it's easy to say, okay, well, take personal responsibility for your whole life. But at the same time, if you were in the Soviet Union and the government shows up at your door, knocks on your door and slaps you in a gulag prison, there's not a whole lot your individual power can do for you. So there is a certain responsibility on the collective and on the government to sort of give people freedoms and opportunities. But at the same time, we need to be willing to take personal responsibility. So there's a delicate balance there to strike in between the two, right?
Yeah, that's tough. Like it's really hard for me to take a stance on it because I really see both sides. Like personally, I think that a lot of the kind of compulsion of the government as far as like where your money goes should be through tax. And I do think that, graduated tax brackets make a lot of sense, just because like you said, right? And I've experienced this, and I work with people who have large incomes, that you get access to things when you have certain levels of income and certain assets that you or I wouldn't get access to, or, somebody that's poor wouldn't have access to. And like an example is, a really good one is like food deserts, right? So you look at like someone who's born in like the inner city in a really low income neighborhood, right? And they're born, whatever, they go to a school, the school's probably subpar because that's just kind of how it is. At least I'm talking about in the US, right? It could be a little different there in Canada, but so you have somebody, they don't have access to the great schools, right? They don't have a car. So they graduate high school, hopefully, right? They get out of high school and now it's time to get a job, right? And they're like, well, there are no jobs around here because everything's kind of run down. So I need to get over to another part of town to basically go there. And I don't have a car, so now I have to take the bus. So now you got to buy a bus pass. And then, you get your first paycheck and you're like, all right, now I've got to pay rent and I've got to get food. And you realize that there's no grocery stores in your neighborhood because you're in a food desert. So you can either, take the bus or take an Uber all the way 30 minutes to another part of town. So you can go to a grocery store, or you can go to the little 7-Eleven nearby and you can pay $6 for a gallon of milk. Right. And so like you actually pay a higher cost for food because you're in this food desert. Right. And it's a very real thing. And it's like, because of where I live, right, because of where I grew up and that kind of thing, like you have access to certain things that, people in those low income areas wouldn't even have access to. And that's just like a really small version of it, right? I mean, there's obviously like levels of like, building up your credit and having access to being able to get loans and interest rates. And there's just a million things that snowball off of that. So I think that you have to find a way to provide, like, you can't provide a completely level playing field to start from without it turning too much into that like communist utopia that just doesn't exist.
Utopia.
Yeah. But I think that you have to have some real conversations about what a fair starting point is. Like, what's the starting point for the lowest of society that they should, like, what basic things should they have access to? And you have to offset, with taxes to be able to provide that base standard of living for those people, right? Because it's totally crazy to me that, one kid is born and has like a trust fund and like would literally never have to work for their whole life, and another kid is born and they have to literally fight like to graduate high school and get a job to make minimum wage. It's not the ideal place for society, right? There's so many geniuses, there's so much creative energy that just gets snuffed out because these people don't make it through the grind. And it's not because they're weak or because they're not strong enough to get through it. It's just because when you have so many people that are born below that level, statistically there's only so many that are going to be able to get through that level. Like there's only so many people that will be able to force their way to the top, and it's through luck and hard work and a lot of combination of things. But
yeah, and I think I want to switch gears here in a second, but I think what we've demonstrated there is how complex these issues are. It's like we got back to how people like to take on ideologies like capitalism is best or socialism is best. It's like, no, things are really complicated, and you better damn well know what you're talking about before you go suggesting what we should do with the economy. You know what I mean? Like it's a very dangerous thing, and anyone who's tinkered with the economy in the past, most have screwed it up. You know what I mean? Yeah. So but yeah, it is a hard issue though, and I understand what you're saying. Like there is, I think I got a quote here actually that sort of ties this in from this guy's actually a biologist that I follow, but he's just a really intelligent guy. His name is Brett Weinstein, or Weinstein. I think it's Weinstein, Brett Weinstein. And he said, it is your individual responsibility to take advantage of the opportunities that you have, but it is our collective responsibility to make sure that those opportunities are available to you. And that, like, for me, that hits home. It's like, that's the line. It's like, we have to make sure that you have opportunity to be the best that you can possibly be, to do what you want to do in life. However, it's your individual responsibility to make sure that you're actually taking advantage of that and that you are living up to your best life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's why I say that I think that you have to provide opportunity, right? Like this is controversial, may not be a popular thing to say, right? But like and I don't mean this like when I say like equality, right? I don't mean like by the color of your skin, right? Like that's not what I'm referring to. But like equality is not something that is inherent in life, right? Like there are people who have different levels of intelligence, different levels of strength, different levels of willpower, different levels of luck, right? Like they were just born into a different situation. Like when you look at nature, right, you see it everywhere. Like the strong survive, right? Like, and it's you can't completely offset that. Like we can do our best as a society, but at some point, right, it is very much up to the individual to take advantage of the opportunities that they have and to give it their best shot. And you can provide equal like opportunity, but you can't, if you try to guarantee equal results, that's really where you get into like communism and stuff like that, right? Where it just all personal incentive is destroyed. Everyone lives in the same apartment, has the same income, eats the same food. Like that's just not a world that most people would want to live in.
But then we lose. This is what people don't understand too, I think, is that if you get rid of inequality, we're all equal. What does that mean? Okay, is it we're all equal height? We all have the same skin color. We all make the same amount of money. We all like the same things. Like equality can really spiral out of control really easy. But fundamentally, it's like in reality, I agree with you. I think inequality is built into the fabric of reality. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing, because inequality, whatever is unequal about you, is the only thing you have to offer to the world, right? So like what are you doing when you go to university? What are you doing when you're studying? What are you doing when you're trying to work really hard? You're trying to make yourself better than everyone else. You're not trying to make yourself equal. You don't want to be average. You want to be better. Now, that benefits society, because if we all individually move one step forward, guess what the collective does? It moves one step forward. But to say that we want to get rid of inequality, for me, it's like, well, no, you want to make sure people have the right opportunities. You want to make sure that we can give people the best opportunity they can to do whatever they want in life. But we have to understand that inequality is built into the fabric of reality, and it's not a bad thing necessarily. It can be good. I mean, that's the only thing that makes you who you are.
Sure. And look, like someone being less successful than someone in one area of life, like that doesn't make them worse than that person, right? Like we're like the value of a human life is not how much money is in your bank account or what kind of car you drive or what university you graduated from, right? Like there are a lot of people who have a lot of wealth that have done a lot of things, that have built empires, that are just like crappy people and have crappy lives, and they're miserable, right? They've hurt a lot of people, they're not happy, and they may work 90 hours a week and just run themselves into an early grave. There may be someone else that decides they want to work 30 hours a week. And I was in this mindset for a while. Like I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I just wanted to be a jiu-jitsu bum. I just worked enough to make enough money to survive off of and just trained all day. And that was my choice, right, at that time. And so you can't guarantee that everyone ends up in the same place, right? The best thing that you can do is just make sure that people are not hindered, make sure that they have their basic needs met so that they can pursue the life that they want to live. And that's diversity, right? Diversity and promotion of diversity is when you have all these people who can live different lives and they can all come together and like form this kind of living being, this society. Just like there's all these cells in your body, like your heart cell is doing one thing, your lung cell is doing another thing, your brain cell is doing another thing. They're all doing independent things. They're all different, like, but they all come together and they form this living organism that's you, and that's the world, that's society, right? Like I wouldn't want to live in a world where everyone's the same height, everyone's the same skin color, everyone has exactly the same house. I mean, like that sounds like hell on earth to me. It doesn't sound like living at all.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to your point there, success is what you make it. Like you can define success however you want. Like in your example there, where you were doing 30 hours jujitsu, I'm assuming your motivation in doing that was that you wanted more free time. to study or to read, or even to watch TV. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that in your head, you define success as being able to have what in your head is a balanced lifestyle. So I'm going to work for 30 hours. I'm going to have more free time. You can define success however you want. There's not one standard to define success. Now, what I've heard some people say is like, well, okay, but what if you don't want to work? What if I'm best served as a happy person in the community, which gives back to people? And my argument is like, well, we all have to pitch in a little bit, right? Like it's like in a household. Like I grew up in a very small town. We had like a wood stove and stuff, and it's like everyone had to take their turn bringing in wood. It's like, if you don't do it, guess what happens? It's going to be a really cold night.
Freeze.
So it's like,
Yeah.
There's some things that we all have to pitch in, because we can't just lie on the couch all day and then society maintains itself. It doesn't maintain itself on its own. We all have to be willing to put in a little bit of work in order to collectively maintain society. But that being said, you can define your success. Now, there's probably going to be some things you don't want to do that you have to do, but overall, you can define success however you want it.
Yeah. And just like you said, right? I think it was like Hobbes. I think it was Thomas Hobbes who said, like, life is brutish, nasty, and short. And he was talking about like life outside of society, right? So society is what gives us the luxury to even sit and have this conversation that you and I are having, right? Like, if we were in the wild, like right now, we would be probably trying to find our meal. We'd be like, all right, the sun's going down. Like we gotta get back to our camp. We gotta try to catch this wild boar so we have something to eat tonight. Your whole life, if you're living in the wild, is dedicated towards just trying to promote some sort of safety and trying to meet your immediate needs, right? The fact that we even have the ability to sit and have a conversation like this just shows like how much society has given us, right? The fact that you could get to a position through working hard where you may only have to work 20 or 30 hours a week to pay your bills and to live a decent life, that's a luxury that you get because of society. Again, if you're out in nature, it doesn't matter if you don't feel like hunting that day. Like your choice is you go hunt and you eat, or you don't, you starve. So there's definitely something to be said for the benefits that society bring us, and the fact that you kind of have a social obligation, right, to give back to that society that's provided some of the benefits to you.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, is that when the larger the collective goes, the larger the collective gets, the less overall individually we have to do to actually maintain it. That's a great point, because you can imagine if you're in a tribe of 4 people, it's a lot of work that's got to be done to maintain that, right? If you're in a tribe with 150 people, guess what? You have a little bit less work to do individually, but we still have work to do. And the downside of having such a huge society is that, like the good side and the downside is that some people can get away with not doing anything, and that's fine. I mean, there's always going to be some people that just don't want to work for whatever reason, and not to necessarily judge them, but society creates a hole for that to happen, and it's like, well, there's not much you can do about that, but individually, hopefully, we can all put in a little bit and maintain society, because it's one thing to move society forward, but to maintain it, that should be like the bare minimum, man. Like we all got to put in a little bit of work.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good standard to live by, is right, that there's going to be some people just through being sick, through whatever happens in life, right, being injured, just being really down on their luck, just having life events occur. There's going to be people that for a time they have to take more out of society than they're able to give back. But I think that the goal should be that every person is able to put at least a little bit more into society than what they take. I mean, then you end up in a place where everyone wins, right? If everyone's able to put in a little bit more energy into the system than what they take out, then there's always an excess. But of course, like, because there are going to be people who are going to take more like I said, just through, life events, maybe things that are outside of their control, there's always going to have to be a little bit more taken from those that, have more of the excess to kind of provide for them. So
now, what would you say to someone who is, let's say, enjoying the comforts of society, which is extremely easy to do? Like, even for me as well, like I struggled with this as well, is that, it's very easy for me to put in my work hours, and then the rest of it, it's like, okay, well, it doesn't really matter. I have enough to survive because of society, because of the benefits of society. Like you said, it's easier for us to sort of live in comfort, putting in minimal work. The problem with that is that over time, people become depressed when they don't accomplish things, and people become sad, and they don't enjoy life. And I mean, depression is through the roof at the moment. So what would you say to someone who is living a more or less comfortable life here in the West, and they understand that, they need a challenge, but they're having trouble sort of getting out of their comfort zone?
So I think, and this is something I talk about in the book, it's like I dedicate actually a whole chapter to it in the end. This idea of eudaimonia. So Aristotle talked about this, and they got talked a lot about by the Greeks in general, but it doesn't have a direct English translation. But basically it means flourishing, give or take, right? And when I think about flourishing, typically when we describe flourishing, we think of a plant. That's what I think of, right? You think of this like this flower that's growing up, it's blooming, it's beautiful, it's green, it's getting sun, it's getting watered, it's growing and thriving, right? And that's what eudaimonia is it's a state that human beings reach where they're growing, they're flourishing. And that is the state that every human being, in my opinion, should seek. Now, one person's eudaimonia may look completely different than another's, right? Like one person, it may be making a lot of money. Another person, it could be painting. Another person, it could be being a librarian. Another person, it could literally be being a janitor, right? But there are things that you can do when you live your life, just taking pride in kind of the way that you do things, that can allow you to flourish as a human being. And there's a lot of things that go into it. It has to do with your mindset. It has to do with seeking opportunities to challenge yourself and grow. It has to do with how you treat other human beings, giving encouragement and positive energy and help to other human beings, so that it brings the best parts of yourself out. And I think that that's something that should really be encouraged, right? It's like a lot of people think of happiness as this end point that happens when you get what you want. Like when I do this, then I'm going to be happy. But then it's like a goalpost that just keeps moving further and further away from you, versus when the goal is like, all right, I want to reach a place where I'm like in this flow, I'm in this groove, and I'm becoming better every single moment, every single day. That's like a lasting happiness. And when you're doing that, you're making yourself better, you're making the world better. You're always improving, so you're always putting that energy back out into like the universe, back out into society too.
Yeah, well, people get too focused on happiness, man. Like, and I get it, because life is dull without happiness. My argument has always been that, we should try and be happy, but we don't get happiness through searching for happiness. We get happiness through doing things that we find meaningful, and doing things that are, I mean, really, that's how I define work now. I used to define work as doing things I don't want to do, but that's a horrible definition for work, man. What I've come to, I've changed my mindset on work now, and for me now, work is when I do something and I'm into it, and I want to get better at it, and I'm actually actively making it a part of my life, and it's something that I'm working on to improve. I mean, that for me is work, and that's where I think meaning is found. And it's easy for us to get lost in our day jobs, and sort of feel like we're not making a difference, or feel like we can't find meaning in our job. But like, I'm gonna call bullshit on that, man, because I have these experiences every now and then. I'm sure you have them as well, where you're going through Tim Hortons in Canada, probably Starbucks for you, but you're going through to get a coffee or something, right? And you get a coffee, and the person that's like serving you, they're just so nice, and they're so kind, and they're just the nicest people you can meet. And then you leave that interaction and you're just happy for the next hour. And then you have and then on the other end of the spectrum, you have CEOs who are just breathing down some people's necks. And there's some good CEOs as well. But the point I'm trying to make is that it doesn't matter what job you have. You can find meaning in pretty much every job. And sometimes it's the smallest job sometimes. Like, for example, someone who's serving you coffee, that for me, it's like, God damn, like these people are finding so much meaning in this job, and it is paying dividends for the world, because every single person that gets a coffee from this person leaves happy. They leave a little bit happier than they were before.
For sure. And look, like there are a couple of points I have that kind of go along with that. So the first is I'm a big fan of Albert Camus also, and he wrote the Sisyphus myth. And the idea is he's using this old Greek mythology of Sisyphus as an illustration. And so for anybody who's not familiar, Sisyphus, he was a character in Greek myth. I think he may have been like a demigod. I think he had some sort of relation to the gods, but long story short, he pissed off Zeus, and Zeus decided that to torment him, he was going to make him push this rock up a hill only so that it could roll back down forever. And Camus' argument is like Sisyphus and like what he's doing is the human condition. There is no escape, right? Like we've been put into this situation where like no one told us what to do. No one told us how to live our life. We're just here. We exist. And the boulder they're rolling is existence. And the only meaning to it is the meaning that you find in what you do. And so he kind of argues that if we want to be happy, we have to imagine that Sisyphus can find happiness even in what he's doing. And like that brings me kind of to the next point, which is I make the assumption that there's no predetermined meaning, and this is existentialism. And I think that is kind of like our responsibility as human beings, is to create meaning in what we do. And like you can have a faith that there's a higher power. Like I think that's great. Like I'm happy for anybody that can experience that. But I think that ultimately, like everyone experiences that lull of like when you're doing something you hate, right? When you're doing that job that you don't like, like you're like, man, this sucks. And you're just like, you're focused on like how much it sucks. And that's where like those moments, and every moment where you don't have meaning, it's really important for you to have the strength to forge that meaning and to start looking for that meaning for yourself, because it makes life so beautiful when you can create your own meaning. Like nothing can stop you. Like nothing, there are always going to be like temporary setbacks and temporary things that you go through. I had an old Instagram page from a blog that I ran a couple of years ago, like 5-6 years ago. And I had about 12,000 followers on it. And I started rebuilding it and posting, and I was rebranding it to be Renaissance Wisdom. And I got locked out. And for anyone who's never experienced that, it is the worst thing to get locked out of like an Instagram page. Like make sure all of your stuff is backed up, make sure that you have access, because I didn't have access to the email or the phone number that I used to create that account. And so that account was lost. And I was like, I mean, anyone who's built a page, if you understand like how much effort and energy it takes to build like 12,000 followers, it's really, 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 really frustrating. And I just kept like, I was really bummed about it. I eventually just kind of made the decision, like, listen, I can't find the meaning to this. I can't find the hidden seed of opportunity that exists here, but I'm just going to have faith that at some point I'm going to look back at this and I'm going to realize that like this was a better thing that happened. Now I'm 120 years in, and I've learned so much more about hashtags and engagement, and I've learned so much as I've gone, that I realized that like that old page, the algorithm never would have favored that page, because I spent so long where I wasn't posting on it. So, you know, I mean, I'm almost to 10,000 followers now, and it's like, it's 120 days. So it's like basically for 4 months, you know, I've been inconvenienced, but, you know, I've built an audience from scratch. You know, I have way more engagement. It's much more meaningful. I've cultivated relationships with people, and they followed me based on them finding a page that they liked that clicked with them versus just having people that I inherited from my old page. So I do think that, now I've found that meaning, right? And it's important to create that meaning, especially when things are tough. Like, it's a really important part of life.
Yeah, well, it's always the case that the things that are difficult in our lives, the horrible times in our lives, the tragedies we have to go through, it's always the case, not always the case, but usually it's the case that you look back on such an event, and if you've had the right perspective, if you've grown from it, you look back on it as, that sucks, but I had to go through that, and man, I tell you, like, it's as simple as something as like learning how to use a fork. Like, no one, like, if you ask anyone today, would you be okay if I just go into your brain and just like destroy that part of your brain that knows how to use a fork, and then you have to learn how to do it again? They're going to say, no, that sucks. That's going to suck. I don't want to learn how to use a fork again. Of course not. But guess what? It sucked back then too when you had to learn it. And guess what? Now you have that skill, and now it's good to go. And it's the same thing with absolutely anything. The difficult things that we have to learn in life, a lot of times they come at us in difficult ways. I mean, it either damages our ego, or it's something like that where you feel like you've lost a huge opportunity. However, in hindsight, a lot of times those turn out to be those points in your life where you learn something that is extremely valuable to you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that those are like those moments, like the moments where everything looked at its worst. When you get through them, those are some of the most meaningful moments of your life. Like, you hear it with like drug addicts all the time. For example, they're like, well, someone just has to hit rock bottom. Like, sometimes you just have to like really go through the shit before you get that like wake up call, or before you really find that like epiphany that you've been looking for. It kind of makes me think of like my philosophical journey, right? So when I started in philosophy, I was looking for God. Like that's what got me started. And so a lot of my energy was spent in the beginning, like I was reading different books by Christians and books by atheists. And so I'd read one book by a Christian and one book by an atheist. Everything directed towards, I'm trying to find certainty. Like, I thought it makes sense to start with Christianity just because I'm, in the West, and that's like what I'm exposed to. And also Christianity bold in the claim that it's the way, right? So I'm like, well, if this one's claiming it's the way, then I probably need to like figure out if this one's true or not. And I'd read one book and I would get pretty convinced that like Christianity was the way. And then I'd read a book by an atheist and I'd get pretty convinced that like, well, that's probably not the way. And I did that, after 10 books or something like that. I think either belief is reasonable, but there's just really knowing one way or the other. And if there's really no way of knowing, and it's just a leap of faith either way, then I feel like logically it didn't make a lot of sense for me that there would be this like omnipotent God that just boiled everything down to a toss of a coin. Like, you'd think that like it would give you more certainty than that. And so then I kind of found, okay, I can't take this leap of faith. And I really wanted to take a leap of faith. Like, I really wanted to believe in Christianity. I think that like that subconsciously, or like my underlying motivation was, I want to create a logical certainty that will allow me to go into Christianity. And when I got to that place where I just realized that logically I couldn't take that leap of faith, I had like the existential crisis. And it was like, well, if there's no, like, if I can't believe in a God, then there's no meaning. Like, life is like meaningless. And I went through this really dark place. And, like, that was where I really fell in love with philosophy. Around the same time, I was reading Descartes, like the brain in a jar theory. And you're like, how do you know that your whole experience isn't just your brain in a jar and some devil is like projecting these thoughts and feelings and images on you? Like, how can you believe in anything? I just had this like super profound sense of doubt about everything, to the point where it was like paralyzing. I didn't know what to believe. I didn't know what to do, what to think. I think that's like kind of the starting point in philosophy a little bit. Like, once you've reached that point where you just realize that everything is so complicated, like everything is just so complicated. But I think you have to hit that point to really be into philosophy, like to really understand the spirit of philosophy. Like you have to hit that wall of doubt at some point.
Yeah, and really what you're talking to there, I think, is you're looking for a place to belong and you can't find it. And that is very difficult. I mean, I dealt with that when I was growing up, and it took me like, I don't know, 15 years to really come to terms with the fact that I was never going to find one group that fully represented me. And it took me a while to understand that, but then it took me a little while to accept that. But once you accept that, it can be one of the most powerful things, because now all of a sudden you don't need to be governed by anything else other than what you fundamentally believe. Is that you can decide through, I mean, not just you, because we're all a product of sort of our environment and our society and our culture, but that you have the power to sort of be an individual, and that you don't necessarily need to be part of a group. And you can still be parts of groups, because life is better lived with each other, and I fundamentally believe that. So you can be part of groups, but you don't need to adopt their ideology. You need to find groups that are willing to accept you for who you are, and understand that you're not going to perfectly align with the group, but you as an individual will, you get to choose what you consider right and wrong and where you want to go, and it doesn't have to be imposed upon you.
Yeah, my favorite piece out of the Renaissance, it's by Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. He was a genius. He was really into Plato. He had some really, really interesting, like from Moses to essentially to Plato, through Plotinus and Pythagoras. He thought all these philosophers had come in contact with a truth that was the same truth that religion bring people to. And he really made this argument that philosophy was important because it would lead people into like a sense of enlightenment that would lead them closer to this divine truth that Plato talked about. And he did this oration. It's called the Oration on the Dignity of Man. And I recommend people to read it. It's a really important piece of work as far as like Renaissance ideas go. He basically said everything had its place, everything had its purpose. And then he thought to himself, okay, like, who's going to enjoy this? Because everything has its place. Like everything is a cog in the machine. So like nothing can really experience this creation that I've made. And so he created human beings, made them with no purpose, and put them into the universe, because now human beings have them to make their own place in the universe. And so Pico says, through cultivation, right, through things like philosophy and study and bettering yourself, you can elevate yourself to be like an angel. Or if you don't seek truth, then you can devolve into the form of like a beast. And so it's a really, really unique idea, especially in that time period, because like all through the Middle Ages, the idea was like, knowledge is a distraction, it's evil, like you just do what the Catholic Church tells you, don't question anything, just be a good little like quiet person, like pay your tithes, go to church, and like that's what you need to do. Like don't worry about science, don't worry about knowledge, don't worry about questioning things. Like that's all bad, that's just Satan trying to lead you astray. And then now you have this like this idea coming along from Pico where it's like, no, we are free, like to actually choose what we want to be in this. Like that's a really, really, really important moment for Western society right there. Like if that had not occurred, we would still very much be stuck in it. Like it didn't happen all with Pico. It had been happening all throughout the humanist movement. They had been slowly progressing towards that. But that's something that is really important for us to hold on to as human beings, right? Like that idea that we have that freedom to determine our own place in the universe.
And I'm assuming, because you're writing a book on it, you're a little worried that we might be going the opposite way now.
Yes. Yeah, that's something that I talk about, right? I think that we are moving in a direction as a society where the individual is really kind of being discarded again. I don't think it's a good route. When you look throughout history and you look at collectivists, whether it's political, it never ends up well for the people, right? Like, it's not to say that, like, for example, socialism isn't evil, right? Like, a lot of people, especially in the US, like, they're really against socialism. Like, some socialism I think is healthy, right? And that's maybe it's not popular for me to say that with certain people, but healthcare, some standard of living, like, these things are important in a first world society, and in all societies really. But you can't sacrifice like the freedom of the individual, right? Like, you can't sacrifice individual responsibility. That's where things really get dangerous. When all of a sudden, like, you have to believe what the majority believes, like, that's just not a good place to be.
Well, I think that's a great spot to end there. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I've talked about your book. When's the book coming out? What's your timeline looking like?
I'm thinking like fall, winter. That's kind of the goal. So I'm working on the last chapter. The last chapter has been taking me a lot longer than what I would have liked to have. I want to try to get this last chapter done, by end of June. Then it's like editing and rewrites and all that. But I definitely am going to make sure that I get it out by the end of the year. I'm not in a huge rush, just because of I'm building a following. The more time I take, the more people are going to subscribe to my email list and that kind of thing. So not in a huge rush, but I definitely want to get it out by the end of the year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's quite the goal. It's quite the goal, writing a book. And yeah, it sounds like it's going to be interesting and useful for these times. Do you have anything else you want to say to the people?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would definitely, anybody that, took the time to listen, if you like my ideas, you want to learn more. So I've got the website set up. It's Renaissance-Wisdom. You can go there. I talk about the book. I talk about the new Renaissance, which is an idea that's kind of attached to the book. And it's essentially a group of individuals who are trying to better themselves. They're studying philosophy, and through their own betterment, they're seeking to impact and make the world better, right? So that's kind of a movement that goes along with the book. If you're interested in the book, you like the ideas, you can also check me out. I'm at Renaissance Wisdom. Put your email in to be notified when the book is ready. I'm not spamming people. I'm not sending out newsletters or anything like that. It's specifically to let you know when the book is ready. So I'll be giving updates as we get closer and I get timelines. And definitely appreciate anybody supporting me, following my page, checking out the email list. Just a normal person looking to spread the word, but I think that the message that I have to share, I think, can help a lot of people.
Yeah, agreed on that. All right, Shane, listen, thanks a lot for coming on. It was a great conversation there. We touched a lot of great points there. So, thanks for coming on. I'm happy you're on your way to writing a book. And like I said earlier, your page is quite good. It's quite a good page there. So anyone interested, check them out. I mean,
thanks for having me on. I had a great time. Had a great discussion. So
yeah, for sure. Like I said, we'll get you on again once your book comes out. That'll be a good update.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much.
All right, buddy. Thanks again. Cheers.
Yep. Take care.